House of the Dragon episode 5 is an odd one. I think off the back of the Battle of Rook's Rest last episode, you might hope for big drama occurring in the aftermath. You know, off the back of Blood and Cheese, episode 2 brought us a lot of chaotic, damaging conflict spilling out in the aftermath, for example. Episode 5 doesn't do that so much, and that certainly does make for a slower episode here. It is slow, and where the other 4 have built up to some big climactic sequence at the end of the episode, we don't exactly get that here. Mostly, I don't mind these things, however. You know, we're going to discuss the good and the bad, we're going to discuss a big contrast I'm seeing develop in the background of this show, but first I want to talk about theme. Really, this strikes me as an episode about grief, I think. The death of Rhaenys has affected the Blacks hard, not just Corlys's pain or even Baela's we see here, but it leaves a gaping hole in their strength and in their council. Rhaenys was an important figure with a great dragon, and without her it means the Blacks have to find strength elsewhere. And in many ways, we see the Blacks doing the opposite of what the Greens did following the aftermath of Jaehaerys' death, which is pulling together. Rhaenyra has quite a close and warm conversation with Baela about Rhaenys. Baela talks openly with Corlys and moves him. He was at first pulling away, but ends this episode resolved to come together and take over as Hand. Jace also has some close conversations with Rhaenyra. There's even a sense of mutual respect and admiration when Rhaenyra talks with Sir Alfred, despite their differences. It is quite interesting again to see the Blacks technically in the weaker position, and yet more sure of what they're fighting for, and largely more unified, with one obvious exception. Rhaenyra's relationship with Jace is 100% more affectionate than Alicent's is to Aegon or Aemond. And I find that contrast interesting, you know? Jace stepped up and took matters into his own hands behind his mother's back, and she was proud of him for it. Aemond is quite literally taking matters into his own hands as he becomes King Regent, and Alicent is terrified about that. Aegon, who tried to do that and failed, is left calling mummy as Alicent walks away from him. I don't think the Blacks are a good side, and I think it's odd when people see it that way. The show is absolutely clear that neither side is good, this is the small folk suffering. But we're certainly seeing the Blacks show they have more strength when it does come to unity than the Greens have. That's one of their advantages, with one obvious exception, and in a large part I think that's why this episode does feel slow. The Blacks have suffered a big loss, and rather than it leading to all sorts of chaotic infighting and rash decisions as we saw the Greens do in episode 2, they mostly pull together. They grieve. It is largely a slow and somber moment. And I think if you're critical about the slowness of this episode, I think that's fair enough. I think you're right, but I also quite like it that way. Especially because there are two subtle underlying points for the future that I do want to draw attention to. One, Rhaenyra is starting to become restless. Without Rhaenys, there is more need for her to step up and fight, there is more pressure. Aegon even went to battle. That restlessness is likely to grow, and I'm still feeling the slow, organic development of a much more fierce and brutal Rhaenyra emerging. 2, they're now looking for the dragon seeds, as they seem to be called. Generations of people with Targaryen blood that nonetheless grew up elsewhere. Rhaenyra mentions Mallister and Tarly as examples, but we're obviously looking at Hugh and Ulf and Alyn. I think it's been quite clear for a while that's where their characters were heading. And I'm glad we're finally getting there, because when the show actually gives them something to do, I hope they can finally express some actual personality. That continues to be my main criticism of this season, I think. But yeah, this development is obviously a big one. Also maybe Lady Arryn, I'm not quite sure where her story is going, but recruiting more people to the Black side, on the face of it, that's a very good thing. That's more firepower. However, this isn't quite the same as getting lords of great houses to bend the knee to you and your dragons and your greater claim. This is recruiting other dragon riders. And if the Greens find out they're trying to do that, will they then start doing the same? I can't remember how many dragons there are spare, but will this be some kind of medieval arms race? And that's also surely a threat to all of this unity I've been talking about, right? New people they barely know and can't trust who grew up in completely different worlds. People you can't just maintain authority over because you've got a dragon. I mean, Daemon's struggling to maintain authority with his dragon, but these are other people you're giving that same kind of power to. That seems incredibly risky. So I think both those points have the potential for a lot of tension in this story that this episode is actually too subtle about. Ideally, we reach the end of this episode with a real ominous dread about where this is going, but it seems a little too subtle for that here. So that's largely what I'd say about the blacks, although I haven't mentioned Damon yet. What shall we say about the greens? Well, first, let's play a game of Simon Says.
What is it, Sir Simon? Is the pudding now served?
The River Lords have come, Your Grace. They wish...
World Anvil subscription.
Now?
They are demanding...
51% off! World Anvil! Yep, they sponsored this video, they're still here, hopefully they'll stay here. World Anvil is an online tool for building worlds, creating characters, designing and managing campaigns for a whole slew of games. Sleuth isn't the right word, I don't know why I said that. Look, you can do all that, you can plan and write stories, you can do all sorts of different stuff for creative projects. I use it for the world building of my novel because my old system of massive Word documents became far too chaotic. Not only does the ability to create timelines with hyperlinks branching off to specific characters or articles or a billion other things, not only does that make it so much easier to quickly find the information I need, it also makes it so much easier to plan things out and kind of keep going. Sometimes a blank Word document for world building is very daunting, so having all sorts of tools to help with visualization, to help you figure out what needs planning next, to keep your brain fizzing and unimpeded, because all of the tools are very straightforward and easy to use, that's really important to me. It's like the sharper an artist's pencils, the freer they are to focus on the art. World Anvil is a very sharp pencil. You can create mind maps, you can rearrange elements of your story, do all sorts of campaign related things for that sleuth of games I mentioned. Yes, link in the description and as a pinned comment should you desire a 51% discount on all their subscriptions, or if you're not yet sure then try out the free version for as long as you like. That's what I did at first and now look where I am, shouting their name at you through a screen. World Anvil! So I've said Rhaenyra is growing more restless, and when someone with a big dragon is growing restless, that's something to put a pin in. Here is primarily the big contrast or conflict or difference for me in this episode though. Rhaenyra is growing restless and more eager to take action on her own. Alicent is growing more afraid and less able to take any action at all. We may or may not be seeing Alicent have something of a panic attack during the council meeting, silent and unable to express any of her feelings at all, whilst Aemon so effortlessly and casually assumes total control. I love this ominous shot of Aemon with the throne as well, beautifully filmed. Perhaps that's my favourite shot this episode. Alicent of course wants to be Queen Regent again, mainly I think because she's terrified about the kind of ruler Aemon would prove to be. She doesn't know what happened at the Battle of Rook's Rest, no one is speaking plainly about any of it, but the fact no one is speaking plainly I think gives her reason to infer something that questionable happens there. She is suspicious of her son, and she is powerless against him. She is stripped of all allies in Otto and now Kristen, and even Larys was once an uncomfortable ally, but it's been a long time since he felt like any support to her. This is perhaps the loneliest Alicent has ever been. All on the brink of a war she can play no direct military part of, when she has just discovered Viserys didn't actually name Aegon, so the war isn't technically justified. And also the cruel irony that the argument of defeating Rhaenyra to protect her children because they would otherwise be a threat to her claim. Well, in fighting her claim, her children are now proving a threat to each other as well. You know, I don't think any of Alicent's and Viserys' children have been raised particularly well. Last video I described it as needing more guidance, and I kind of worded it that way for the sake of a segue into a sponsorship, but really what I'm talking about is emotional support. Alicent goes to tend to her potentially dying son, and I was wondering if this was going to be a moment for her to cry and grieve and now feel regret for how she unintentionally pushed Aegon Aegon into that battle. An awareness of the fact that Aegon has pretty much been doing whatever his mother wanted him to, trying to win her approval this whole time. Only I don't think that stuff is at the forefront of Alicent's feelings here. Personally, I think she was looking at her burned and broken son, thinking, this is like Viserys all over again. Tending to an ill and broken man out of my duty. I'm right back here again. What has any of this been for? I think Alicent is a powder keg waiting to explode. I don't know what power she still has to draw upon. We shouldn't forget Otto isn't out of the picture, and I don't know what she will do, but something is building within her. Just as it is in Rhaenyra. Rhaenyra's outlet will likely be her dragon. She's got that power she can directly assert. Alicent's, I don't know, but she will need something. And perhaps Helena is also a powder keg. I keep wanting to see more of her and see how she's holding up. We get a brief glimpse of her this episode, but the show is keeping her at a distance, and that only makes me feel all the more like something is building there. And then also the people themselves are quite literally a powder keg this episode, becoming restless and desperate and starving. Now trapped in a city where the pressure may build and build, especially with whatever Alinda is being sent to do, things are going to absolutely explode. Especially when this episode began with Maylise's head being dragged through King's Landing and one commoner saying in pretty blunt, on-the-nose dialogue, I thought they were gods, and Hugh telling him they're just meat. You know, let's not forget Rhaenyra's conversation with Viserys in season 1.
Everyone says Targaryens are closer to gods than to men. But they say that because of our dragons. Without them, we're just like everyone else.
If those dragons can be killed, if the common folk can see literal proof of that, well, again, there's been lots of hints this show that we shouldn't underestimate the will of the people. And I haven't read the books, but I am going to go out on a limb to say surely there's some kind of peasant revolt or uprising on its way somewhere here. So maybe the theme isn't about grief. Maybe the theme is pressure, a powder keg, a volatile situation primed to explode. And so again, yes, I like that about this episode, whilst also wanting more of it, wanting it to be less subtle, to let it build more and end episode 5 in a much more ominous, dangerous sense of where things are about to go. I think ending on a conversation between Jace and Rhaenyra deciding to seek out these dragon seeds, that feels a little underwhelming when we've already been getting hints about that for ages before anyway. But yeah, still a solid episode in my opinion. There's other things to say too. I like seeing Criston more troubled and less sure of himself. Last video I described him as a rock of a man, gradually turned more and more rock-like over the course of the 2 seasons. He's just this bitter shell now who talks with that hard edge like he is just so done. A lot of comments mistook that for a compliment. I meant to say he has been a bitter, empty shell of a person for a long time now. A man who so passionately believed in honour and yet has entirely soiled all of it until he's just committed himself 100% to the only thing he has left to live for. He has been like a ghost compelled by a single haunted desire. And he has been very arrogant. He's seen battle before, but mostly successful battle. He's been swift and effective and sure of himself as a military commander. He went out with total confidence that he could go from one place to the next, raising support for the Greens and subduing all opposition. And then it got to a battle where dragons were unleashed and Aegon almost died, almost killed by the very person Criston has been quietly scheming all sorts of tactics with, and then he saw bodies be burned alive. That's absolutely rocked him. His voice almost breaks describing it. You feel like he isn't too sure of his support for Aemond right now, but it's the boat he's in and it feels too late to turn back. I like seeing Criston both incredibly troubled but also trying to suppress it. Daemon, I was wrong about. I said the last video that all of these dreams and past guilts were leading to a place where he would come away more resolved and more sure to commit himself to supporting Rhaenyra. I think it seems I got that the wrong way around, because Daemon quite clearly talks this episode about raising his own army to take King's Landing. Rhaenyra can join him there if she wants, and she will technically be the one named as Viserys' heir, but after such a grand and mighty gesture of invading the capital, Daemon would be looked upon like the true king. Sounds damn ambitious, and in terms of what happens with the Blackwoods and the Brackens, nowhere near as straightforward as he hopes, but it's clearly in Damon's mind as an aim. Admittedly, I am growing a bit tired of the Damon scenes. As a therapist and a huge fan of The Sopranos, I am quite partial to long dream sequences, but I don't think the dream sequences we're getting here have anywhere near enough substance to justify the runtime being devoted to them. They're all quite straightforward and telling us the same things. I'm not all that intrigued by who this woman is that Damon is acting out some sort of perfume advert with. Perhaps it's his mum based on Alice's comments. I'm not that fussed either way. Because the more pressing question for me is, why the hell is Alice, if it is her causing these dreams? It could just be the weirwood, but Damon seems to partly think it is her. Why is she doing any of this? She does somewhat explain her motives, but I feel like Damon should be confronting her at some point and going, look, can you stop giving me all these dreams? What are you doing? What are you up to? Who even are you? The two of them have had a back and forth for the last couple of episodes, and I want it to come to a head at some point. Whatever it is going on between them, their conflict needs to progress, and especially when Damon is a temperamental, impulsive man. It's odd how he's accepted all of this madness quite calmly so far. Something else I just wanted to touch upon because I've seen it crop up in the comment section fairly regularly, and I think this video might be my final chance to actually mention it. Rhaenys last episode got a pretty badass death that a lot of people saw as heroic, and Rhaenys was something of a fan favourite for a lot of people, and there are a lot of characters who miss her this episode. Off the back of that, you get this kind of conflict in the audience between seeing her as heroic and people saying, but what about when she killed hundreds of people in the dragon pit? What about that? Why are you forgetting that? I imagine this is something a YouTuber much bigger than me mentioned at some point, because it seems a pretty popular opinion that the writers have somehow forgotten that and started trying to portray Rhaenys as badass, or even that in the scene in the dragon pit she was supposed to be seen as heroic, and in my opinion, no. We were never meant to cheer Rhaenys when she burst forwards. That scene has a lot of shots to emphasise just how many innocent people are dying and screaming and running for their lives. To Rhaenys, from the perspective of the Highborn playing their Game of Thrones, it feels powerful and daring and awe-inspiring. From the marketing point of view, where we're meant to pick between Team Green and Team Black, it feels powerful, but that's the trick, right? Of course it's not actually heroic. This show is all about the ways ordinary people suffer whilst also never getting any voice and being made to pick between two awful sides. The way the show itself is drawing upon. Until, of course, these dragon seeds. They seem set to get a voice on the stage now. I am very, very eager to hear what they have to say, and if they can do anything more with that voice than just picking a side, or if the same social pressures restrict them too. Will they fall into the same trap where they see heroes where I suppose we're meant to see cruelty? So yeah, those are my thoughts. I don't know what I'd score this episode, maybe a solid 7. Although I don't know why I've fallen into the habit of ranking them out of 10, it's rarely as straightforward as that. But yes, let me know what you think. Comment everything under the sun. Like the video, subscribe, maybe even support me on Patreon or buy me a coffee, but otherwise, hopefully see you next time. And as ever, a special thank you goes to Flying Spider, Grace, Kellyanne Davidson, Luke Hoare, Michael Gallagher, Chad Bramwell and Joshua C. Follier. Thank you.